with the Liberals, LFK and Green. We're going to hear from them tonight. That policy directives are not worthy of debate. And that concerns me because we needed to know how John Jordan felt on these matters, not just how Doug Ford feels on these matters. But even if Doug does promise things, we don't have the trust that he's going to follow through with them. He's had a track record of flip-flopping on a number of issues, from the sex education to his affiliation with unions and minimum wage. We just can't trust what he has to say, and so it would have been nice to debate these things. I would say, by contrary, we are the authentic Conservative Party that is available to people who are inclined to vote that way. We have a track record to be established, but our promises are to be fiscally responsible, to be transparent, and to be truthful. We want to have free votes in the House, no party whip, and we want to make sure that if I do not represent you, that you have a recourse to hold my feet to the fire and make sure that I do what I promised to do. In addition, we have some innovative policies on energy and the economy. We want to reduce the PSD on the gas tax, and we want to ensure that there's radical reform for healthcare. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mulder. And now over to the Liberal candidate, Ms. Olkermock.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for coming up this evening. Thank you to our host and moderator. I would also like to say thank you to all of the first responders who have been working tirelessly since Saturday, to Hydro One, to Public Works, who are working around the clock to clear our roads and to keep us all safe. And so I'm a mom and a teacher and a municipal councillor. I ran in 2018 because of an experience that I had with my mom. And we went through the healthcare system. I saw firsthand how hard our frontline healthcare workers were working with the limited resources that they had. And I saw big gaps in care, especially around home care and long-term care. And so that's why I ran in 2018, and I'm running again because now we're all aware of the state of home care and long-term care. And I really believe that we need somebody with the lived experience down at Queen's Park if we're going to see some serious change to the system. I am also a teacher. And so when I think about education and how we currently have a Minister of Education who went to private school and a parliamentary assistant who was homeschooled, I think that Doug Ford appointing these two sends a pretty clear message to all of those invested in public education about where his priorities lie. And so our riding has been underrepresented for years. Our communities are growing, and yet our infrastructure is lacking. While the Conservative government is very focused on Toronto and building highways, the Ontario Liberals have a plan, a fully costed plan that includes you and our communities. I'm pleased to be here this evening to share the plan with you.
Thank you. Now we have Ms. Spruitt.
And echo my colleagues' comments, thanking you for organizing and for being here. I'm Marlene Spruitt. I'm here representing the Green Party, and our Green vision is for an Ontario that cares for its people and the planet that we live on. My background as a family physician and a medical officer of health demonstrated to me that the greatest threats to human health and our economic well-being is that of poverty and climate change. Yesterday, Ford called the devastating storm that took 10 lives a once-in-a-lifetime event. So was the 2018 Ottawa tornado and the BC floods. Climate change will bring more frequent and severe extreme weather events. Ford doesn't get it. During the past 4 years, Ford has reversed any progress by canceling over 700 green energy projects, ripping out EV charging stations, and fighting the carbon tax in court with your tax dollars. Tax dollars that could have been spent shoring up healthcare, long-term care, schools, or small businesses during the pandemic. We need to take action now to reduce our fossil fuel dependence. while at the same time making life more affordable for you and protecting all those vulnerable populations, those living with disabilities, workers trying to survive on minimum wage, seniors living in long-term care or needing home supports, individuals struggling with mental health or addictions challenges, children and families recovering from lost learning and income during the pandemic. The Greens have a plan, real solutions for real people. We can't just build highways to get out of our problems.
Okay, thank you. So those are the opening statements. Let's get to the questions. I have one. This one concerns COVID-19. Obviously, it's been a lot of talk over the last 2.5 years. It's disrupted a lot of lives, a lot of businesses. I want to know what your government's approach would be to imposing any new pandemic restrictions, or how you would do things differently moving forward. Okay, I'm going to start with Mr. Mulder.
Thank you for the question. The Ontario Party believes that individual liberty is very important, and in fact, critically important. We do believe in adults making decisions for themselves and public health officials offering advice to help individuals make good decisions. We would, as a party, decide or introduce legislation that would make it virtually impossible to bring lockdowns in for a future COVID outbreak or a monkeypox outbreak or any other outbreak, to make sure that people are informed of what their responsible action is and let them decide for themselves to comply.
Okay, thank you. You have up to 2 minutes. We're going to turn now to Ms. Polker-Mott.
Do we have 1 minute or 2 minutes
2 minutes.
to respond?
2 minutes for questions. Did you want extra time? I didn't make that clear. I thought it was 2 minutes. It is 2 minutes for questions. Yeah. You don't have to use 2 minutes.
Good? Okay.
Sure. First of all, do you want an extra minute, Mr. Mulder, or did you just, that's all you had to say on the subject? Okay. All right, we'll turn to Ms. Polker-Mott. I'll restate the question. What would your government's approach be to imposing any new pandemic restrictions, or how would you do things differently with the specter of the pandemic moving forward?
So I believe in following the science and the data and making decisions based on that science and data. And so I know moving forward, the Ontario Liberal government has committed to investing in manufacturing our own vaccines here in Ontario. That was definitely a gap that we acknowledge, because of the pandemic, that we need to be manufacturing our own vaccines at home instead of relying on other countries to be able to provide them. So we are committed to that aspect, as well as making sure that we are equipped with PPE and again, making sure that we can manufacture that right at home. And really, like I say, it all does come down to following the science. And I don't believe that any government would or likes to have to impose lockdowns, and we all feel the effects of that. And our businesses really suffered. Our students in schools with mental health and learning loss. It's not something that is taken lightly, and so moving forward, I really do hope that we have a full review of the handling of the pandemic, so we can take lessons learned and really strengthen our healthcare system and society to be able to handle the next pandemic that comes our way.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Pruitt?
Thanks. Like Amanda, I believe in following the science. I was one of the medical officers of health that sat on the round table, as Doug Ford called it, that gave advice on policy implementation to try and protect people against the virus. I think we need to carefully think about that word restrictions, because they weren't restrictions as much as they were an attempt to be protections. Protections for all the other people in society. So even though I may have an opinion about what I think is right for me, I should not be allowed to take actions that will negatively affect other people. And so for that reason, it is sometimes necessary to put in place protections that protect those that are more vulnerable. That said, Ford didn't always follow the advice of our table, and some of those protections were unfair. Small businesses were closed down, but Costco and Walmart were allowed to stay open. That was unfair. Businesses, some of them got benefits, some of them didn't. No one really looked in detail at what was happening. And then later, when they realized there were overpayments, nobody's trying to get that money back. Again, that's unfair. So we always have to look at all the unintended consequences of any protections that we put in place and make sure that they are fair to all the individuals that they may have an impact on.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Thompson?
So first, I'd like to say that Ford did probably the best he could have done with what he was given. We weren't gonna, no one knew we were gonna head into a pandemic like we have dealt with for the last over 2 years. And that was something where no matter who was in power would have had to make these hard decisions. So that has been something for sure that is important to say, is that he didn't get a handbook on it, but there were some areas where things could have been improved. When it comes to the NDP and myself specifically, as someone with a disability and very vulnerable, already on a ventilator, I learned that very quickly that this could be the disease that would kill me, because that was what it looked like from the modeling. And for my aspect of life, sorry about that. I had to take in consideration my own risk when it came to this. When it comes to what we can say anyone would have done differently in terms of the pandemic, we can't really do that either, because we weren't in that position to do so. And so with that being said, for me, I would have definitely made sure to focus and create focus on the actual small businesses. We are rural riding. Our small businesses are the backbone to our rural riding, and our small businesses were neglected. And it was these small businesses that were faced with a number of challenges throughout the whole pandemic, where they were open and closed, and not had the supports given to them when needed it. And so as a business owner myself, I understand that, and it is something that I have really realized is one of the big things for what one of the, I would say, mistakes was not giving the right compensation to the businesses that needed them at the time when they needed it, and letting the big box stores stay open, and them being the ones to reap the rewards of this pandemic. And it has been that way since, and it just continues to go that way.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to hear your questions if you have any. The microphone's right back there, sir, the center aisle, or on the far corner over there. I'd like you to state your name, please, and if you do want to direct it at a particular candidate, again, I'm going to let all the candidates answer, but if you have one general question for everyone, go ahead, sir.
My name is Ken Fisher, and I'm from downtown Charlotte Lake. My context is this. We are really on the Titanic, hitting the edge with climate change globally. Any one of us can stand up and tell a story about the latest crisis. My favorite is that on one day in Antarctica, 1 week in Antarctica, just 3 weeks ago, the temperature went from -80 to -20. just like that. In British Columbia last year, 400 people lost their lives in a heat dome. When will we stop playing nice with first past the post and in some way or another, among the people, the parties that are science-based, that are progressive, make a move cooperating and
All right, so you have a question about electoral reform, or is it about the environment?
it's a question about the urgency of cooperation among the progressive parties in the face of an election. That is the question. When will the parties, your parties, cooperate with the other parties in working together instead of continually, supporting our own little part of the puzzle?
Okay.
Is that clear enough?
It's about as clear as Sharp Lake,
The West.
but I think I understand.
Okay.
We live and work in a parliamentary system where majority rules, you realize that, right?
I do, and in the state of a crisis, there has to be some other response than taking the old way for granted.
Okay, cooperation among the political parties.
Yes.
Is there enough of it? Is there room for improvement? We're going to start with Ms. Polkermock, up to 2 minutes.
Thank you for that question. And so I know that Stephen Del Duca, the Ontario Liberal Party leader, throughout the pandemic called for all parties around the table, that the pandemic was nonpartisan, that we needed the best ideas around the table if we were going to come up with some real solutions to the problems that we were facing in the pandemic. And he did that on multiple occasions, and I know that he is committed to including the other parties around the table should an Ontario Liberal Party be elected come June the 2nd. When it comes to electoral reform, he has also come out in favor of ranked ballots, and in our costed platform, which is available online through the Ontario Liberal Party website. And like I say, if you reference the actual costed part of the platform, there is a line in there committing to putting together a citizens' assembly and to look at electoral reform and how we can move forward, move past first past the post. So just a few things from the Ontario Liberals on that front.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Pruitt, how can we get the parties to all play together in the sandbox?
The Greens have long been in favor of changing the parliamentary system to that of proportional representation, and any opportunity we get to move that forward, despite our small voice in Parliament, we would do that. Similarly, Mike Schreiner has met with Del Duca and Andrea Horvath, I think, on several occasions. I know I was invited to several meetings of where they would talk to the other parties and have representation to speak on issues that were relevant. I've heard them all say that they would be willing to work together, but that none of them feel that they could work with Doug Ford because Doug Ford doesn't want to work with anybody else. I agree, climate change is critical. We need to move on it very quickly. And we've also given thought to making a form of legislation that would include a coalition that would deal with just the issues that related to climate change, so that at least that serious threat could be dealt with in a more cooperative and collaborative fashion than perhaps some of the debate on other legal reforms. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Compson?
Yes, so in regards to electoral reform, we as NDP are in favor of electoral reform as much as we can. We are in a system where the people don't get the popular vote and we need to be able to have people represented as much as possible and have their voices heard in an equal way to where we are living life. In regards to climate change itself, climate change, we obviously, as he pointed out, a 40-degree change in one day is I'm president. The NDP has a great climate change initiative in place with the New Democratic Deal, and it's one of the strongest climate change platforms in Europe. Like all of the parties going forward, we have focused on trying to create the changes necessary to bring forward the people to help make sure our climate is protected. We are not protecting and trying to change it for us ourselves, but for the generations to come. And it is without cost that we are trying to make sure our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are the ones that are able to stay inhabited in this earth, and that we are not ruining it for them. And so as the NDP, we're focused on creating that climate change difference that we need. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Muller?
As far as it comes to parliamentary reform, our party believes that democracy requires representation of the individuals in the riding. And as such, we would introduce legislation that would eliminate the office of party whip. So there would be free votes for all members of parliament so that they can truly represent their constituents. Right now, essentially, all that votes that matter are the premiers. We've seen that on the provincial level, we've seen that federally when Jagmeet and Trudeau got together for the Emergencies Act. It was only 2 votes that mattered. We need to have representation of the individuals in the riding, and therefore the individuals in Parliament need to be free to express their views, and that way we will see cooperation, because I want to represent you. I don't want to have to toe the line of somebody. So on that level, I think that level of change will institute what we need to get cooperation. With respect to climate change, I think we all agree that the climate is changing, and it's changing radically. The question that I would bring is, are the efforts that we're doing to try to reduce our carbon in the face of massive output of carbon of developing nations, in China in particular, is that money best spent in reducing carbon, or is that money better spent in instituting compassionate changes for people who are affected by these things, and try to protect people from these radical changes that are coming one way or another? Not to give up on trying to have clean air, clean water, clean land, but to also mitigate the damages that are coming from it.
Okay, thank you, candidates. Thank you for the question. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Yes, sir, go ahead.
I'm Brian Gilpin from Charlotte Lake. I've been in protest for a long time against this vaccine. I would like to know from every one of you the proof that you got how well this vaccine has been working for you, especially when you have the first dose, then you have to have a second dose, and then booster, booster, booster. When I've been with other people in the same situation, have got this virus and stuff like that, and got through it with other means, like with vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, and of course ibuprofen, ivermectin.
Okay.
Wait a minute, I haven't finished. Just don't cut me off.
Get to the question.
Okay. Question is, how come you take my freedoms and rights away, even if I go to the Hill to protest on that behalf, whether it be truckers, motorcycles, or all our own groups in that? And now you've taken our own rights away for July the 1st. I want some answers. Where is my rights and freedoms, and where's the freedoms for everybody else?
Okay, thank you, sir. Well, we're going to start with Ms. Spruitt.
So the 4 of us here haven't taken anything away from anyone. We're candidates in the upcoming election. The current government that you elected democratically made decisions that best benefited the majority of people, because we work in a democracy where the majority rules. Those decisions are made by your elected officials, and you have an opportunity at the next election to change that.
you. Mr. Thompson?
I took the the vaccine, and I can say that it has not done anything to me, that has changed who I am as a person or changed the way that I live my life. But the vaccine also has reduced the mortality rate. It has also reduced the amount of exposure that people get and the infectious rate. So the people who have the vaccine do often not transmit it as frequently. And so, and then it has also reduced the costs on our healthcare system with not as many people needing as intensive care situations due to diagnosis.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mulder?
When it comes to the vaccine, my belief and our party's belief is that that decision should be reached between a doctor and a patient, evaluating the risks, and evaluating the benefits of the vaccine. And I do not believe that governments should get in between a doctor and their patient in making that decision. However, the efficacy of the vaccine seems to have been one of the things that has been clouded in this whole discussion. There's many people believe that the vaccine stops transmission and stops infection, but it did have some effect in the early stages. But by the time we got to the Omicron variant, in terms of infection, there was virtually no, I think it was around 12% benefit is what the latest research was showing. But as early as August of last year, it was shown in Massachusetts at a study published through the CDC that the infected, or the ability to spread the virus, the transmission, was identical between vaccinated and unvaccinated. So to force somebody to get a vaccine to stop the spread when the vaccine doesn't stop the spread, I don't think the logic is flawed. But again, the principle is that decisions should be between a doctor and their patient, and we should also respect individuals' deeply held moral convictions and religious beliefs on that. There's been historical precedents in the courts where the judge says that they do not feel that they have the right to get in between a person and their conscience. And we've had governments that have gone way further than that judge has said in previous decisions. So thank you for the question.
Okay, and Ms. Poldermock?
So I am gonna put it out there, I support vaccine mandates, and I do believe in following the science. And I know when the vaccine first came out, I went and spoke to my doctor and I spoke to public health. I went to the experts, learned about it, and pulled up my sleeve and got my first dose and my second dose and my booster. And I meant to start with this, I am not a medical expert, but I seeked the expertise of those that I would turn to in any medical event. From my understanding of vaccines, it isn't supposed to prevent you from getting it. It is supposed to minimize the effects of the disease on your body. And so remember, before we introduced vaccines, I can't remember what wave it was during COVID, but hospitals were talking about having to triage who got a bed and who didn't. I believe it's because we introduced the vaccine that we are coming out of this pandemic. And I am fully vaccinated, my kids are fully vaccinated, and I see that we are moving into a territory where we can start moving past COVID. But kids to go to school are required to have mandatory vaccines. And as a mom of 2 kids, I know that you don't just go for 1 dose of that vaccine. You have to go back for your boosters to make sure that your children are fully vaccinated. So boosters aren't new when we have vaccines either. So I'm going back to my very first point that I made tonight, is I believe in following the science, in following the data, and turning to the experts. I am not a medical expert, but I turn to the medical experts and follow their advice.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn to our next question.
I have one more question.
Actually, as a courtesy to the others who are lined up, do you mind just letting them go next? And you can certainly ask another question, sir, but they've been waiting as well, so. Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, my name's Helen, and I want to thank all the candidates for running. It's quite something to put your life on hold and do something like this. You were speaking to supporting small businesses and being disappointed about how small businesses were dealt with during this last few years. Unfortunately, for most of the leaders of your parties, except maybe one exception, I wasn't hearing that same kind of compassion, I would say, to small business. But my question is, I guess Amanda, you believe in the science. I'm wondering if you or anyone else has read the 5 papers that have been recently released. There's some very interesting scientific facts in there on their trials, one of them being that they did not recommend combining different types of vaccines, for example, AstraZeneca and Moderna. So that put a lot of people in a precarious place, although doctors and the science table was saying that was fine. So now that some of this information is coming out, I would just like to know, first of all, have you read any of them? If you plan to read any of them, and make your comments about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. We're going to start with Mr.
Who's lying?
I have not read any of those recent documents released, but do plan on reading them and getting a little bit more in-depth knowledge into what has come out from there. And other than that, I don't know the exact science behind it as well, and definitely will be reading up on it for sure.
Thank you. Mr. Mulder?
Yes, I agree in following science, but science is a wide spectrum and it requires representation of views across the table. To say science is settled on something, maybe on gravity, that's been well tested to see that it's there, but this is a vaccine and this is a disease that's new, and there's a lot of divergent opinions, and some science has actually been suppressed, in Canada at least. For example, natural exposure to the virus creates immunity, not just antibodies to the spike protein, but a series of cellular responses to fight a virus when it's been replicating in your system. Other jurisdictions have recognized the value of something like that, whereas in Canada, it doesn't exist. So what science are we following? With respect to the Pfizer studies, there are other studies as well that have demonstrated a variety of levels. I've seen different vaccines that have had effective rates as high as 80% against the Delta variant, whereas the vaccines that we have here in Canada have been very low against the Delta and against Omicron even less. So I do believe in following science. I do not believe in censoring science. And unfortunately, there's been a suppression of data. And that's particularly frustrating because most of us are evidence-based in our thinking, but when the evidence that is presented to us is skewed, we come to different conclusions. So we need all the evidence to be available, and then those of us who can read the evidence and make an opinion on it can do so freely.
Thank you. Ms. Polgermach?
So I mentioned that I have had conversations with my family doctor as well as public health. And I remember when Doug Ford mentioned that he wanted to decrease the number of public health units before the pandemic. I believe going from 44 down to 11. And I can't imagine how differently the pandemic would have played out had we had these huge public health units. And I was very thankful for public health units that covered Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston, and for our vaccination rates here in our riding. We were leading the way in Ontario, and I'm very proud of that accomplishment, and I know that it's owed to our public health unit and the doctors and frontline healthcare workers for that. And I also know that a lot of our areas are suffering from a doctor shortage. And so I'm thinking that if you have questions about the vaccine, that you really should be seeking out your family physician if you have one. If not, know that the Ontario Liberal plan is that we will hire 100,000 new doctors, nurses, and frontline healthcare workers and create community health centers so you can go to a reliable source and get your information from somebody that you trust and make decisions based on, like I said, based on an expert, somebody that knows what they're really talking about when it comes to vaccines in your body. Thanks.
Right,
I'm
thank
wondering
you.
if the
Hey,
candidate, I'm wondering if the candidate could just answer my question though, if she has read the Pfizer papers.
how they want to, yes, the Pfizer papers and combining vaccines.
Answer the question.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
You know, it's up to them how they want to answer it, okay?
Well, we are here to ask questions and we do like to have answers.
Okay, well, we're gonna turn now to Ms. Spruitt.
So there are so many scientific papers out there that nobody, unless they are full-time focused on immunology, is going to have time to read all the papers. So I haven't read that particular Pfizer paper, but I have read the NACI statements and the NACI recommendations, the National Advisory Committee on Immunization. Any company, when they make a vaccine, always says at the beginning that they don't recommend it being mixed with other companies. It happened with the meningitis vaccine, it happened with the measles vaccine that was introduced 15, 20 years ago, it's happened with pneumonia vaccines. Part of that is the company has just not done the study of their vaccine with another one. They don't know how it might work, and so the recommendation will be, we don't recommend it, because they cannot guarantee that it will be effective. That said, the scientists, the immunologists that understand how vaccines work and how they work in your body, look at the different papers from different companies, see that the method of making the vaccine is similar, and make a recommendation that this is not dangerous, it will not hurt you, and so it is a reasonable thing to mix the vaccines. There have been a couple of follow-up studies, some showing no difference, some showing that actually there may be benefit to mixing the vaccines because they're slightly a little bit different and you widen your protection. Science is an evolving process, and 6 months from now, we may get different information as we go forward. We could only work with the science that we had at the time the decisions were being made.
Okay, thank you. On to our next question.
Hi, my name is Karen, and I appreciate all of you and your courage to stand up during these tough times. And I'm really grateful for debate. It's something I've wanted for 2 years on a number of issues. So my question is about the sex education curriculum. And it's also about, we've spoken about some important issues like we live in a democracy with majority rules. And we also have a sacredness in the physician-patient relationship. There's also a sacredness in the family unit, in the parent-child relationship. I have been an educator and a small business owner for 25 years, and I have the distinction of my first day teaching on the plans. First day the sex education curriculum came in years ago. The classroom teacher didn't want to teach it and wanted a supply teacher to teach it. Having something as important as sexual education being taught in the classroom is a very precarious thing, especially I've taught grade 5. I'm very concerned about not only a number of issues in the sex education curriculum, but also that gender identity has been mentioned 41 times in the document. It's something that is too precious to I think, hand over to an institutionalized program.
Okay, you're making a statement now, but do you have a question?
Yeah, my question is, what is, as candidates, what is your view on this? And if we are to have a democratic, I know the party in power, but we have an education system that that this now has become a topic that everyone's talking about.
Okay.
So I'd like to know your opinions.
Your
Well
views
said,
on
well
the
said.
sex education curriculum. Okay, we'll start with Mr. Muller.
Doug Ford ran on the
Ontario
platform
Party.
back in 2018 to scrap the sex education. I even heard him in an interview essentially mocking the gender thing, saying, well, how many genders are there? And yet, within a very short period of time, Doug Ford reintroduced the sex ed curriculum virtually unchanged. And I do have a copy of some of those curriculum things here if someone wants to talk to me about them afterwards. They're pretty explicit, and it's my belief and my party's belief that that sort of thing should primarily be taught by the parents. I understand the need to educate children about risks of abuse and to educate risks of internet abuse and such, but some of the questions in these curriculum go way beyond that. I have here a census for students put out by the Limestone Board that for kindergarten to grade 3 includes questions of gender on a spectrum, just like the skin color is on a spectrum or religion is on a spectrum. And that's for kindergartens who don't know how to count to 10 yet. And now we're asking them to identify whether they're a boy or a girl or somewhere in between. And so our party also believes that it's important to leave that sort of thing to be taught in the home and not to be involved in institutional education.
Thank you. Ms. Polkermoff?
So I support teaching sex ed in schools. I support the LGBTQ plus community. And I know that under the Ontario Liberal plan, we have put $15 million aside to create a supportive action plan for the 2S LGBTQ plus community. I know as a parent who just recently received a notice from my son's school. As a parent, if you are uncomfortable with the topics that are being covered, you can opt out of having your child participate in the sex ed discussion. I know that the revamp of the sex ed curriculum that happened around 2018, I believe, you turn to experts in the field, parents, teachers, a whole group of people are consulted prior to any curriculum coming out. And we need to make sure that our curriculum is staying current as times are changing. And one of the biggest changes in the curriculum program that happened was around online safety for kids. And times are changing, and we, like I say, curriculum overall, we need to make sure is up to date. And specifically for the sex ed curriculum, like I say, you can always opt out. And if you're willing, to take that on and have those conversations with your kids, leaving the school out of it, fine. But I think it is really a partnership between the school and parents to carry on that conversation.
Thank you. Ms. Pruitt?
Thanks. I agree that it is a responsibility of a family to discuss issues of belief within their family structure. However, it is also the role of the school and the education system to prepare our children for the society that they are going to live in. So that society includes gender diversity, and if they don't understand that that may exist out there, it exacerbates the hate, the anger, and the violence that we see in our community. So you may believe that you do not support homosexuals, but no one has the right to be violent. And so part of the reason that we put an education system in is to just make our children aware that these differences exist, but they're not necessarily threatening to them. We also educate our children to protect them. Lots of five-year-olds grow up in an environment that actually might be threatening. There may be a neighbor that's actually taking advantage of them. And if they don't learn that they can talk about those things, The incest that used to happen in the 50s remains hidden because everybody says you can't talk about it. If you start talking a little bit about sex and gender and personal touching in a classroom, it opens up the opportunity to identify those children that may potentially be harmed. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Yes, for sure. Sex, just following what Ms. Pruitt had said, sex ed is a very important part of the curriculum. A lot of people do not feel comfortable having that conversation even with their own children, and that is where we have a lot of issues that do come up, where we have unwanted pregnancies that because they were not taught about sexual education, where we have diseases spread because they were not taught about sexual education. And then we also have people who feel they're not necessarily themselves, and they don't think that there is anything other, or that being gay or trans or anything that is an issue, and they feel that because it's not being given to them as opportunity and told that these options are available, they then have self-hatred for themselves, and that causes them to then end up self-harming and other situations. So it's very important that sex education is part of the curriculum, and that students are able to learn sex ed as they grow up, because it changes all the time and things are changing. We're in a progressive world where things change on a regular basis, and it's important that sex ed is part of our curriculum. And yes, as they have said, others have said, you can opt out of sex ed for your children, but in all beings, it still needs to be part of our education system.
Thank you. I think this gentleman here was at the microphone a little bit longer, so I'll get to you next. In the meantime, sir, go ahead.
Hi, John Watts from Neighborly. My question is, we've heard candidates talk about the scientific data concerning COVID. Can anyone tell me what the efficacy is of wearing masks? A statistic, please.
I'm going to start with Ms. Polgerbach.
So I don't know off the top, but I do know that my family doctor, again, conversations with my family doctor, very important. He recommends that we wear a mask. When I go to see him, he's wearing a mask. I know that it minimizes transmission, and so I wear my mask. I wear my mask when I'm grocery shopping still. I wear my mask when I'm door knocking. If wearing a mask can help protect somebody else, I'm gonna do it. And it's not a big inconvenience. And today I've chosen to wear my KN95 because I believe in protecting myself. Whatever I get, I take back to my family. But I believe in protecting all of those that I come into contact with. And I heard somebody chuckle back there about me wearing it when I'm door knocking. I wear it door knocking because I never know who it is that's answering the door on the other side and what their circumstances are, and I will never put anybody in any jeopardy. So I wear my mask to make sure that I am doing my part to protect those around me. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. To the question of the efficacy rate of wearing a mask, if you know it, and if not, try anyway. Ms. Pruitt.
It's not just one number, it's a bunch of different numbers depending on which study you look at and which situation it is and what kind of mask it is. So if you wear a fit tested N95 mask in a hospital setting that's measured and fit you, you've got numbers up in the 80% of protectiveness. If you wear a KN95 like Amanda and I have today, your numbers are somewhere in the 60% range of protecting. It also depends in those studies how much time interval they measured over time. Did the individual wear the mask all day? Did they keep it over their nose? We've seen people in the grocery store walking with the mask over their mouth. I saw one guy once in Costco with a hole in the mask drinking through a straw. So it really depends on the circumstances of the mask. A cloth mask will actually protect others quite a bit because your virus particles that you're breathing out are caught in the mask. But if you want to protect yourself, you need something like the KN95 or the N95s. They give greater protection. So we're talking about a continual protection depending on the type of mask, the length of time it's wearing, and how disciplined you are in wearing it. So now that we take them off to talk in the microphone, it's kind of like wearing a raincoat in the rain. If you take it off for a few minutes and it's still raining gently, it won't get too wet. If it's raining really hard and there's lots of virus out there, you might still breathe it in. So wearing your mask longer and better fitted is better for everyone in the end. Indoors. Outdoors is a different story.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Council?
So, yeah, I don't know the exact efficacy rate in terms of percentages, as Ms. Pruitt had just said. And I have always focused on wearing my mask as much as I can at all times when I'm in public settings, because as someone who is learned and lived through our healthcare system and how the situation with a mask can reduce the risk of transmission. It is something that I have found comforting to myself, and that's where I focus on trying to make sure I wear a mask at all times. When in a closed indoor space, obviously I'm doing it this evening where I'm just trying to keep it off to speak, but otherwise it's hard to hear from me. So that's unfortunate. I don't have the exact efficacy rates that you just heard from, but that was your answer to the question. So
Thank you. Mr. Mulder?
Unfortunately, I don't have the specific efficacy rates, but from all the data that I have read, it is highest in a well-fitted N95 mask. But just let's clarify what well-fitted means. That means that when it's fitted to your face and you're in a hood and they spray a nasty smelling substance around you, if you can still smell it, it's not fitted well. And so that kind of mask does offer a limited amount of protection for the individual wearing it from aerosolized virus particles. Any other mask gives very, very minimal protection against aerosolized substances. Now, early on in the disease outbreak, it was thought that it was spread mostly through droplets. We all remember Justin Trudeau speaking moistly, and where you're just having that barrier in between you and the other person for droplets. But we now know that the bulk of the spread is through aerosol. And the ironic part is that we are wearing masks until we speak, and then we take our masks off. Well, the only time we're generating aerosols is when we're speaking or sneezing. And so sitting here with my mask on when I'm not speaking, especially when I have facial hair, does nothing for an aerosolized pathogen. All of the N95 masks do not have a rating on them for use in viral protection. In fact, they don't have protection ratings for asbestos, which is much larger than virus particles. So if you're going to require respiratory protection, you need a ventilator or a respirator that is well fitted to your face, and even then, getting into a biological hazard is totally different than a particulate hazard. One droplet, one aerosol can go a lot further than one piece of asbestos. So I don't think that they have anywhere near the efficacy that is claimed, and that's it.
Thank you. On to our next question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Hutchinson. First, I'd like to thank all of the candidates for coming forward and putting their names on the ballot. I've been there, done that, and it's not an easy thing to do, and I thank you. My role in recent years has been that of an advocate and an activist for social housing and affordable housing. We have had difficulty for years. It has been escalating. Certainly the last 2-3 years, we are now in crisis. And I'm wondering, does your party have a plan? Can you tell me something about it? How is it costing? Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't get your name.
Sorry, Janet Gutowski.
Oh, Janet. Okay. All right, we'll start with Ms. Pruitt.
Definitely the Greens have a plan, a housing platform that was put out well before the election. Other experts have called it a master class housing plan. It includes over a 10-year plan putting 1.5 billion new units into the system, but that would be a variety of units. So that can actually be done without increasing sprawl, without paving over farmland, and without creating more distant suburbs that expand commute times. So we're talking about something called the missing middle, where in urban areas, probably not so applicable here, laneway houses would be permitted, houses could be split into multi-units. We could put 2 duplexes, triplexes, and up to quadplexes in areas to increase the density. And we would also be able to add housing in transit corridors, above retail spaces, and other situations where they're not currently allowed to be zoned, assuming that that would be appropriate. There's also talk of improving brownfield spaces so they would be clean and allowed to be building. Rural areas have been hit particularly hard. Housing prices exorbitant. They flipped, the landlords are kicking their tenants out, and rental housing is atrocious. We're aware of all the problems, and our plan, which I can happily give you the link to later, goes into great detail to explain how we would try and solve all those problems.
Thank you. Mr. Cumpson, what's your party's plan to address a lack of social and affordable housing?
Yes, so in terms of housing, the NDP's fully updated housing platform, Homes You Can Afford, is a comprehensive plan tackling the housing crisis from multiple angles and grounded in the fundamental principle that housing is a human right, but is not an investment commodity. So in our riding, we have experienced a lot of people coming into the riding from big cities, from Toronto, from Kingston, from Toronto, Ottawa, and they are increasing our house prices exorbitantly over the last little while. And it's what is happening is it's kicking people in this riding that they have lived in their entire lives out of this riding because they can't afford to continue living here because they are not able to afford limits. We also have a goal to bring in real rent control that will actually allow people to be able to afford an apartment and afford a place to live, because right now the cost of renting is through the roof, and the issue is like a house in Frontenac County to rent is going up $4,000 a month, and that's not, no family can afford that, and it's something where we are struggling and people are struggling. The other issue that we need to focus on is that we also need affordable and accessible homes. We have a number of people in our current area that are aging population. They need to have an accessible home to live in, and to find an accessible home is a very difficult thing to find these days, and it's not something that is easily accessible to everyone. And that has been something that, for me, as someone with a disability, I could not find an accessible apartment anywhere in this riding that would accommodate my disability. So we are trying to make sure we have accessible and affordable homes for people to be able to access and make sure that every person has a home to live in.
Thank you. Mr. Mulder?
Yes, the housing crisis is indeed a crisis. In a study of G7 nations, the average was 471 housing units per 1,000 residents. In Toronto, there was 360 per 1,000. That is a shortage of homes. Complicating that, we have increased demand. And part of that demand has come from our immigration policies in our nation, where more than 50% of the immigration to Canada comes to Ontario, and most of that to the Greater Toronto Area and the Ottawa area. And so those areas now have even higher demand. So we have this perfect storm of high demand and low supply. Why do we have low supply? Well, rent controls actually contribute to decreased supply. If you're going to build a housing unit for rental and you're going to be restricted on what you can rent, you don't tend to build that rental accommodation. The other thing that restricts housing is strict zoning regulations, and we do believe that we have to make a policy change, not necessarily a funding change, but a policy change with respect to zoning to allow for the greater development that's been mentioned. I spoke to constituents up in Smith Falls or Carlton Place, where they're working on a project called One More Home, the idea of a laneway home. A temporary measure for sure, but the idea is if we can change some zoning regulations and free things up, then we can let builders build what we actually need, affordable housing for all.
Thank you. Ms. Polgermock, what's the Liberal plan to create more social and affordable housing?
Thank you for the question. It's something that definitely comes up when I'm out knocking doors, whether I'm in Verona or Almont. It's across the riding, and it's a very important conversation to have. So under the Ford Conservatives, they did eliminate rent control. The Ontario Liberals have said that they will bring that back in. We will build 1.5, very different number, 1.5 million homes over 10 years, creating 150,000 jobs across Ontario. And in order to build those homes, though, we know that we really need to work with municipalities. I know Lanark County has a housing action plan. And so we know we need to work with municipalities and end exclusionary zoning. We need to look at intensification. One thing, again, that comes up is people are concerned about urban sprawl as our communities are booming. We want to make sure that we're protecting that prime agricultural land around our communities. So we need to look at intensification and, like I say, ending exclusionary zoning. We would put a tax on current homes that are sitting empty and ban new non-resident ownership. And lastly, and perhaps the most important part of your question, is that we would really work to promote a housing first model to help get people who aren't or who are homeless, who currently don't have a roof over their heads, into a home. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Janet. Good to hear you got your power back on, by the way. All right, over to our next question. Yes, sir, go ahead.
My name is Wade Leonard. I'm a resident of Frontenac County and a teacher in this building. Over the past several years, since the Ford Conservatives have taken leadership of the province, our education system has become under increasing stress. First was with defunding the loss of programming and increasing class sizes, coupling that with the pandemic and increasing class sizes during the pandemic. The system is under ever increasing stress. In Australia, about 15 years ago, the Australian government followed the same process of privatization with public funding of private schools. It's been an abject failure. What would my question is to the candidates, and thank you all for running. I know it's largely a rewarding but somewhat thankless job that you're pursuing. My question to the candidates is, what is the position of your parties to ensure the long-term sustainability of our public education systems in Ontario?
Thank you. We'll start with Mr. Cumson.
So with the NTP platform, we are focused on making sure that we hire more teachers and education assistants to help with our issue of not having enough teachers and not having enough to be able to reduce the class sizes. And that is one of the main things that has become an issue in class sizes, especially after liberal and conservative cuts to our education system. I went to a college school in Parham, which was closed under the liberal government because it is too small. There wasn't enough actual students to be there. But what happens to those students that are now not with the school there? They're now on a bus for 40 minutes to get to school. And that has been something we are trying to avoid. But we are planning to add more education workers as well as teachers to be able to provide our public system with the support that it needs throughout the future. We also, Doug Ford recently has said basically that it is up to the school boards and the schools to fundraise to keep their schools open, and they cut a huge deficit out of their budget where we are now dealing with further things, $12 billion shortfall. And so we are now trying to make sure that what that means is when they're telling us that you are not fundraising enough and that is why your school is being closed, it's because that is where people are like, oh, so we have to do more bake sales to keep our school open, and we can't have that. That's not what we can have right now. Our schools, that just makes it so that rich areas get all the schools and our lower cost living areas are struggling to keep schools open, and they're telling us we have to fundraise to keep them open, and it's just not okay. So we need to focus on that when it comes to making our healthcare or our education system sustainable in the future.
Thank you. Mr. Boulder, your party's position on long-term sustainability of public education.
First of all, I want to thank the questioner for being a teacher. I think education of children is critically important, and I know that you think our job is thankless here. We all know your job is very brutal. And so thank you for the sacrifice that you do and for all the teachers doing this. And we do want to support education in general. So we would like to see implementation of best practices for mathematics, for literacy, for science, and make sure that the curriculum that is used is excellent. But we do agree that there needs to be a diversity in terms of the methodology of education. One size fits all institution-based kind of learning, I think, as time has passed. I do believe it still should be publicly funded. And as such, we're introducing a concept called charter schools, which is a private organization that is providing niche kind of education for different areas. In addition, we believe that if parents choose for whatever reason to homeschool their children or to have their children educated in a religious based school, they should have that freedom and they should be supported financially. Currently, the funding model is, I believe, $12,500 per student, and we believe if parents choose to leave the publicly funded education system, some of that funding should go towards that child's education. So to summarize, we do support a strong public system, but we do support choice within that system.
Thank you. Ms. Polkermont.
And thank you for your question. So when it comes to education, I strongly believe that we need to have a supported publicly funded education system. And the first thing I think of when I think of more rural schools is the funding formula. Right now it's per pupil, so like Drew had mentioned, rural schools who have only a few students or fewer students, it's just a formula that just doesn't work for our rural schools. But I also know as a teacher, having a classroom with 3 different grades in it trying to teach also isn't very effective of my resources, but ultimately for the students. Like what sort of level of education are they getting if I'm trying to split my time three ways. Even split classes are a challenge when you're trying to teach two different grades in one class. So part of the Ontario Liberal plan would be to scrap Ford's plan for Highway 413 and at a cost of $10 billion, and instead take that money and invest it in our schools across Ontario. And that would be to build new schools as well as fix up some of our aging schools. We would like to cap class sizes at 20 across the board, which would really help with the amount of time that a teacher can spend with students. We would create an optional grade 13 for high school students to counter the learning loss during the pandemic, hire more mental health workers to help our students. We need to take care of their mental health if we want them to be learning. Hire 5,000 more special education workers. And one piece that I find is often overlooked is student nutrition program. We need to make sure that our students who need breakfast get the breakfast that they need to learn things.
Thank you. Ms. Pruitt?
I could have finished those after 30 seconds for you. Because we too would add actually a school lunch program. Poverty is a significant problem for many of our children that are going to school, and I think many teachers are aware of that. So making sure that they have adequate nutrition in form of a breakfast or lunch program will help them learn better. Our children are our future, and we need to invest in those children in every way that we can. We're not convinced we can meet the 20 kids in a classroom model that the Liberals have put out. They've costed it differently than we have. We're set it at 24. We think that that number is more reasonable. But the point is, we think it needs to be lower than it is now, and would do everything to get those numbers down appropriately. You asked about sustainability, and that's a hard thing to commit to because the government changes every 4 years, and it might have been sustainable for 15 years when we had Liberals in power, but then Ford got in and it changed it. So I can't promise you sustainability, but we put forward plans that we hope would improve upon and make up for the reverses that happened the last time. We would also be ditching EQA, whatever the letters are, of the testing system. We think that teachers are spending a lot of time helping their kids pass a test instead of learning to live in the society that they live in and deal with problems and problem solving in a general way. The Indigenous curriculum would come back. Ford scrapped that throughout that planning, and we think that critical to going forward in this society is our children need to understand the Indigenous people that lived on this land before us. And with respect to mental health, there would be more mental health workers in the school, and also trying, might not happen in communities this small, but in many of the larger centers, youth wellness hubs near or close to the school, so there would be places for kids to go after school that would be entertaining and would help them get involved in things other than education.
Okay, thank you. All right, on to our next question. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for doing a great job. And to all the candidates, thank you very much for coming up and talking to us in such an educated way. I'm a retired surgeon and I live on Bob's Lake. And my question is something different. It relates to police brutality. And I have not been personally involved, but my family has been. And I know that it occurs. And perhaps it's not something that is very largely in our rural community, although I'm sure that there are some instances. But the point is, it's real. And police brutality, and in fact, lack of accountability is a big issue. I want to know what your parties are going to do about managing that, because it seems like the insider way in which police matters are handled doesn't really cure the problem.
Okay, thank you. The issue of police brutality and the lack of accountability in law enforcement in general. We'll start with Mr. Muller.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of police brutality recently, and unfortunately, it seems to stem from the top. When it comes to lack of accountability, we see when our political leaders are apparently above the law, we see that kind of corruption filter downstream. The Ontario Party's charter starts with the phrase that we acknowledge the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And nobody, no person is above the law, whether that be our Prime Minister, whether that be our Premier, whether that be our police officers. Anyone who violates the law should be held to the account. And corruption is inherent in our system politically, and we need to address that through, I think one of the measures we've talked about is recall, to sort of that the constituents can hold the elected officials to account. And I think when that culture changes, my hope is that that culture would change in police forces as well. But we don't have to wait for the culture to change. We are under the rule of law. So when we find people who are breaking the law, we should make sure that that law is enforced, regardless of their position, and regardless if it's in the best interest of our country to pursue that individual. It's the law that is our rule, and so all of us are subject to the law.
Thank you. Ms. Polker-Mott?
Yes, thank you for that very interesting question. I know that under the Ontario Liberal platform, and so when I was thinking about your question, I know that when we talk about police, not all, but a lot of the incidences that happen are around people suffering in crisis from mental health. And so I really believe that we need to invest in our community mental health services. And I know under the Ontario Liberal plan, we are committed to hiring 5,000 new mental health workers across the province, and working with emergency room departments as well, making sure that there is always a mental health worker in an emergency department to help de-escalate what could become an incident that would require police intervention. So I do believe that, like I say, getting down to the root cause of it, and so mental health training is also a big piece, and looking at anti-racism programs to help better equip our police forces for the issues that they're facing. They're usually the first ones to respond. And I do believe that we really need to look at the police system overall, and highlight also the process for victims of gender-based violence. I've had a few conversations with people who you know have had some feedback around policing and around policing around gender-based violence. And so I do believe that we need to look at accountability and how we can support our frontline officers. Thank you.
Thank you. On the topics of police brutality, lack of accountability, police reforms, perhaps better oversight, Ms. Spruitt.
Thanks. I think it's a complex question because police are governed by various boards, in some levels of municipalities, and some, of course, there's a provincial police force in Ontario. And the culture varies from community to community. We've heard significantly greater problems from Thunder Bay, for instance, with a lot of negativity in the Indigenous population there. It goes back a lot to what we were talking about in the education system. So if we bring up our children to be accepting of other people and of differences, and to minimize hate and to consider other people as equal, then they are less likely to be violent towards them as a youth, as a teenager, and then later in their job if they end up being a police officer. Many of the police officers currently in the force, of course, are older and didn't go through that open-minded school system. And so we need ongoing education within the police force police force regarding racism. We need full investigation of all complaints, and we need discipline of the police officers that may have been accused of that if found guilty. Traditionally, the police force has been quite closed, and they gather around their own and they protect them, and it will take some time for that culture to change. Additionally, more mental health support for police, because that's not something they've been trained to do, and eliminating the opportunity to card people where they might be picked up or just checked on because of color or background. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Compson?
Yeah, so the biggest thing I think is accountability, as you had said, and that is where we have a system where police investigate police, and if a bad police officer is being protected by other police officers, that also makes them bad police officers. So we need to make sure that accountability is one of the biggest things, and that's something we definitely do not have in our system. And that is where we need to also focus on creating change in the system when it comes to systemic racism, when it comes to the barriers that people are faced, and that the issues of trying to make sure that everyone has equal opportunities, which is not the way we have it. And that is something where we need to take into consideration accountability on all aspects, and that they need to be held accountable for their actions. It's not time to let them be able to just kind of run rampant, and we've had that issue, and we do have a lot of issues with police, and that is something that we have trying to make sure that doesn't happen, because that's how people lose the community aspect of it, as well as the trust access of police officers is the mistrust that gets brought in. So it's definitely time for us to make sure that police officers are held accountable for what their actions, and make sure they are available to do so. Also, I grew up on Bob's Lake, so that's home for me.
All right, thank you. On to our next question, sir.
Doug Steele, and I live on a property that borders on 7th Highway. My question is to the candidates, has your party any policies that are going to have public transportation go along 7th Highway again? The Greyhound bus system has quit, and you can't get out of get onto any bus or anything on 7th Highway unless you have a car. Can you answer that question?
A straightforward question. Let's see if we can get a straightforward answer from the candidates here. Public transportation will resume on Highway 7 in some form, Ms. Polkermock.
Yes, thank you for this. I hear about public transportation from both seniors and also youth. And so youth are concerned about getting to jobs after school and around, to see their friends, and seniors are concerned about what will happen when they no longer drive. So under the Ontario Liberal Plan, we will continue and make permanent a community transportation grant that organizations can apply for. And I know that this is just a start. When it comes to rural transportation, we can't apply the same lens as we do in urban centers. Each of our communities are very unique, and so we need to apply some unique solutions. So what I would like to see as well is connection between our communities. Why isn't there a bus that goes from, our communities out this way, even into Ottawa? and then where you can connect with their public transportation system. So I do believe that we need to tap into some of the ideas that our communities have. Some of our communities have started to create public transportation, well, a network at least. And so as your MPP, I would be advocating for more resources to be able to sustain those programs, but also expand those programs. And like I say, increase communication, collaboration between communities to see what we can really work out. Thank you.
This question
Thank
is a
you.
very
Ms.
local
Pruitt,
question.
what is your party's
Very
stand on
topical.
public
It's gonna
transportation
reveal how
improvements on
many
Highway 7?
are
So Greens are
tuned
big on transit all over. It's much
to
cheaper to
the
move
Sherbert
several
Lake
people in a
Highway
bus than
7
it is for
situation.
5 of them to be in individual cars going down the highway. We would revert
Via
to a
rail
funding formula that
is a
goes
big
back to
issue.
giving municipalities 50% of their
Proposal
costs
of
with
having
respect to transit.
a possible train
And then
come
we
through
look
Sherbert
at
Lake,
rural areas with a unique lens,
train,
because a
stop.
community such as Sherbert Lake, of course, is not likely going to be able to sustain its own internal transit system. So there would be additional grants going to regions or
We'll
groups
see
of
if anyone
municipalities
is
or
knowledgeable
counties,
about
for
it.
instance, like in this case, Frontenac County, that would look at intercity transit, so that there'd be ways to communicate and travel between one small town and another. I don't know whether that route would exactly go down Highway 7 in the route that the Greyhound might have gone, but it would be up to municipalities to get together and decide where most of the traffic went and try and plan a system that would work for those individuals.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
So I just had this conversation actually today with a constituent about how transit has been a major issue in this area and that people aren't able to get to things. And one of the big things that came out of it was even just with what happened on Saturday with the major storm, people were trying to get from one place to another and they can't. And that has been one of the main issues. Our party is focused on that, investing in helping municipalities make sure that they are able to stay on board when it comes to that and work with communities to provide transportation. We should have some form of transportation to get you from Sherbert Lake to Kingston or to Perth or to Ottawa that is available, affordable, and accessible to everyone. And that is one of the things that I know has been something that's lacking. And I even know, like, from back in the 60s and 70s, when my grandma was teaching at the original Sherbert Lake, there was a bus that would go from Sherbert Lake High School into town every day to help people get from one end to another. So it's doable and it's been done. So it's, just about investing in that and making it happen for this community.
Thank you. Mr. Mulder, your way or the highway?
Well, I lived in England for about a year and I loved the transit system there. I mean, you could go to northern Scotland on buses and trains, but the population there is quite a bit higher than here, so we have obviously some inherent problems with that. Our party in general believes in opening up the more remote areas of Ontario through increased transit and highway production as well. I think we also have to look at some of the obstacles that have been in the way for private bus services to operate. And fuel prices obviously would be one of those ones. Right now, our fuel prices are much higher than they need to be because of taxes. And again, one of our party platforms is to remove 16 cents per liter off current prices. So that might make it more attractive for private buses to operate. Whether or not we would operate a public system would be an evaluation of the need and what resources are available and allow that to happen. I personally love the idea of some form of public transit. Again, getting a backpack and going across the country on public transit is a great experience, and I think it's good for our country as well. So personally, I'm for it. We don't have a specific policy on public transit in the area.
Thank you. I think the feds, if I'm not mistaken, were studying a high-speed rail corridor along Highway 7. They announced that a while ago. I think that's still in the works. So that is federal jurisdiction. This is a provincial election. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, my name is Lucas Redmond.
Sorry, say that again.
My name is Lucas Redmond.
Okay.
My question is pertaining to the minimum wage. What do you think the minimum wage should be?
We'll start with Ms. Pruitt.
So the minimum wage is currently too low. We would start immediately by taking it up to $16 and then adjusting to inflation. But the real goal in the end is to have what's called a livable wage, which would meet the needs of a family depending on the area where they live. So housing costs, food costs are different in different parts of the province, and these numbers have been calculated and range anywhere from, I think, $18 to $22, depending on which area of the province you're in. We also support a basic income guarantee, and we would immediately be doubling the Ontario Disability Support Program benefits that are currently at $1,167. That means an individual who's disabled may need more than the average person in terms of transportation support, has to survive on that. Rent, food, housing, clothing, it's legislated poverty. So we would immediately increase that, and that would move us, make the first step in terms of making a basic income guarantee available to all of those who are living in poverty.
Thank you. Mr. Cumpson, your platform on the minimum wage.
So right now, in terms of our platform on minimum wage, we hope to have it at $20 an hour by 2026, increasing it by $1 each year until then. And we are definitely in a position where it's not enough. $15 is not enough for minimum wage, and people cannot support or live on that. It is just not available. We also have a focus as well on ODSP and OW as well as one of our things. So within our first year, we plan to give a 20% increase immediately, and then also from there, by the end of our second year, our minimum wage will be double what it was, and also include that of inflation as well. So we're focused on bringing minimum wage up, and right now, I would say in terms of minimum wage and the way life is going, in terms of just what I have experienced, it takes a good, probably right now in today's society, $20 minimum wage would be great right now, but that's obviously not attainable at this time.
Thank you. Just a quick reminder, we're going to take one last question after this round is wrapped up and then move on to closing statements. So you will have the last question in just a second. Next is Mr. Mulder on the issue of minimum wage.
The Ontario Party believes that minimum wage is a job killer, and as a result, we are not in favor of increasing minimum wage. From my own experience in running a business, if I had to pay an extra $5 an hour for an employee, they would have to be generating that extra value for me, or I would not be able to afford to hire them. And so the Ontario Party's policy is to increase the ability of entrepreneurs and business owners to pay higher wages by offering tax incentives and wage subsidies. And that can stimulate more jobs in various areas, particularly in the food service, agriculture, and manufacturing, so we can get the people of Ontario to work at a wage that is doable for the business and is livable for the individual. In terms of the ODSP and that sort of thing, when someone can't work, obviously the minimum wage isn't going to help them very much at all. And our policies in general for supplemental things for disability and things like that would be where a person can work, not to penalize them for working. Currently, the situation is such that if you're on disability and you earn money, you have that clawed back through your disability. And so we would like to say that there would be an incentive for people to work, because work is good. Work makes people feel better about things. And so if we're gonna allow them to work 1 day a week, we're not gonna penalize them for that. So supports for employers and supports for those on disability, I think, are two strong things we stand for.
Thank you, and Ms. Polkerbach.
Thank you for the question. And so the Ontario Liberals are committed to increasing minimum wage to $16 an hour starting in January, while we develop a regional living wage program. So that's our plan forward. But looking at affordability overall, when it comes to ODSP, we are committed to increasing ODSP 20% over 2 years. And increasing seniors' pensions by $1,000, and bringing back the basic income pilot project that Ford scrapped. So really, we want to be taking a more holistic approach at affordability and different programs that people tap into. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, it is time for our last question from the audience this evening. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Ian Mackay. I live outside the town of Verona. I'm pleased to be with you this evening. I thank the candidates who are with us for their willingness to come and share and participate in this important discussion and debate. I'm also disappointed that there was one candidate who chose not to come for whatever reasons. Having mentioned that, my question has to do with an issue that just came up on the news that I turned on the radio this evening. Another horrible gun violence that's happened in some little town in Texas, where I think it was, I heard a 12 or 14 young children murdered, killed from gun violence. Now, we have seen this happening in various other parts of the USA, Buffalo in particular, more recently. We are also seeing it becoming more and more widespread, not only in Ontario, but across our whole good country. And my question is to the candidates who are with us, what is your party's position concerning the whole business of gun control? I can well understand that we are all concerned and abhorred by gun violence, but I think one can lead to the other, and so I ask the candidates for their party's opinions concerning gun control in Ontario at this present time.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Some of their answers may touch on federal jurisdiction, by the way, that the province may have not enough control over. We're going to start though with Mr. Compson, your party's position on gun control.
Okay, yeah, so obviously gun control is a big thing. We plan on focusing on control where people are not able to have guns that are illegal. And as someone who grew up in this riding and grew up as a hunter and got my gun license and my hunting license when I was 13 years old, I understand that it's a big part of what a lot of people in this riding do live a daily life with. And we're not looking to take away people's legal guns that they are holding and that they have legally obtained and that they have the proper registration for. We are focused on getting rid of the guns that are illegal and people have obtained illegally on our especially. Our riding is definitely not downtown Toronto, but we do have plans to help with removing those guns in Toronto. And it's time that we make sure that gun violence is stopped. It is something that has become its own pandemic in itself. And that's where we need to focus on trying to make sure people understand that there is the right to legally bear arms for purposes that are used on a good stance and way to live life. And there's also issues where people are not able to have guns, and we need to make sure that those are focused on. So that would be our party's stance on it.
Thank you, Mr. Gumson. Other end of the table, Mr. Mulder.
Criminals that cause crime with their guns need to be punished. We need to make sure that those criminals do not have access to firearms. And most of the firearms that are used in Canada for criminal purposes are illegal weapons. And that needs to be cracked down on. And again, people often speak against our police forces. But one of the things the police is responsible for is cracking down on that kind of importing of weapons and to enforce law against people with illegal weapons. We've seen Liberal governments federally and provincially discuss gun control, and I'm sure we'll hear a bit about that. People who have a gun license are probably the most law-abiding citizens in the country. And there's no reason to have gun control against people who are lawfully using their weapons. The ones that are owned by people are not the ones that are used in crimes. And so the situation that you brought up is indeed a tragic situation. Again, it speaks to a whole criminal element that thankfully is not a big part of our culture here. Controlling guns is not the solution to it. Restricting the actions of criminals is the right response.
Thank you. Ms. Polkerbach.
Thank you for the question. As a teacher, I take gun safety very important. I know growing up, we didn't have lockdowns, we didn't have home insecures, but we've seen an uptick in guns being brought to schools. Stephen Del Duca and the Ontario Liberal Party have come out and said that they would ban handguns. And that would, ban the sale, possession, transport, and storage of, that we would work with the federal government and offer to fund a buyback program and, really work to stop the illegal guns coming into the province, and so the smuggling at the Ontario and the US borders, as well as advocate to extend the ban nationally so that guns can't be funneled through interprovincial borders. And so, again, this is specifically talking to handguns, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Pruitt.
Thanks. The situation in the US and in Canada are dramatically different, and it really is can be attributed to our current gun laws, which are actually fairly strict. You need to have a mental health check, you need to have a license for your gun, and most of the gun sellers follow those rules. So most of the episodes that have happened in Canada, and I'm not sure I agree with you that they're getting worse. I think, you get one peak and then you don't get anything for a number of years. But most of the episodes that happen, the individual obtained the gun either illegally or they borrowed it from a relative or a friend who might not have stored it appropriately. And so, we need to remind people that do have guns to keep them locked up. We need to continue to monitor and continue to maintain the gun laws that we have. And we need to crack down on illegal guns. So I think the Nova Scotia shooter, which was 18, if I recall, a couple of years ago, those guns were brought in over the border. Better checks at the border will reduce guns that are here, and when individuals are found to have guns illegally, they need to be punished accordingly. I'm not convinced that banning handguns would make a difference, because handguns are pretty well controlled as they are now. But you know, most people who enjoy shooting and go to a range are going to be are following the rules. But again, if the guns fall into the wrong hands, they get used inappropriately, and we have to work on that aspect. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, we've reached that point in the evening where it's time for the closing statements from the candidates. We're going to do it in reverse order from the opening statement. Each candidate will have 1 minute for their closing remarks, and we're going to start with Ms. Pruitt.
Like the gentleman earlier in the evening, I too regret that our Conservative colleague isn't here to defend some of the plans that they have, so we don't actually know the reason why they think that building a large number of highways will actually help bring our cost of living and housing prices down. They will certainly improve work for individuals in the construction industry and for the private companies that are shareholders of those construction industries, but they won't do anything to bring the gas prices down or your food prices down. I would have liked to have heard the rationale behind that. The Ontario Greens platform presents a real plan to invest in a caring society, one that cares that people get the right health care, the right home care, and the right education. Connected communities with transit and housing we can afford, and a new climate economy that creates jobs, reinvigorates our manufacturing sector, and protects our natural heritage. Think green.
Thank you. Ms. Polker-Monk.
Thank you to the teachers' unions for hosting. Thank you, Bill, for moderating. And thank you, everyone, for being here. And another thank you to the candidates up here who have shown up and put their name on the ballot, which isn't an easy thing to do for sure. So this election is about priorities, choices, building highways in Toronto or investing in education. Privatizing healthcare or investing in publicly funded healthcare and transforming how we care for elders here in Ontario. Protecting big business or investing in the talent and people right here at home. Priorities matter. Choices matter. 2018 was an anomaly for the Liberals, and the NDP didn't take a single seat from a Conservative. Liberals are the only ones to beat Conservatives. If you don't want 4 more years of Doug Ford, on June 2nd, vote Liberal, vote Amanda Polker-Monk. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Muller.
I agree. This election is pivotal. There's some great clear lines in the sand here. I'm sitting on the right side of the stage, and I represent the conservative, the truly conservative view in this riding. If John Jordan had been here tonight, I think he would have been more comfortable sitting on that side of the table. Doug Ford's track record has demonstrated that the progressive conservatives, or as I like to call them, the liberal conservatives, have become very liberal. And so for those of you who desire to vote conservative, have a track record of voting conservative, in my view, you have one choice in this upcoming election. And if you choose to elect me, I will serve you and represent you as the best that I can. And again, I will be free to do so without being controlled by my party. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Compson.
Yes, thank everyone who put in the time to be here tonight. I know this has been a bad weekend in terms of weather, but thanks for coming out this evening and for hosting us. When it comes to the Conservatives, and they have not shown up, and what is an MPP but someone who is representing their riding? MPPs are elected and are to represent us. And these nights like tonight are basically job interviews where we are asked the questions on what we will do. And unfortunately, the Liberal or the Conservatives have not shown up to a job interview for this position at all. and it's time that we create that change. So what I want to make sure as well is, as the NDP, we got 30% of the vote in 2018, and we're the only ones that are in power and opportunity to win this election in this riding, other than the Conservatives. And it's up to us and the constituents to put me in Queen's Park to fight for you. I've had to fight for my life to be alive in here today, and I'm going to fight for every constituent in this riding and bring the actual dignified representation back to the riding, where we are able to have someone they can be proud of at Queen's Park and someone they can support.
Thank you. Well, that concludes our all candidates meeting this evening. I want to thank all of the candidates who did show up to answer your questions. And thanks to all of you for asking them. We covered a lot of topics tonight, and hopefully the answers will help you make a decision leading up to.
Here's the candidates. Thomas Mulder, Ontario Party. Amanda Palker Mock, Liberal Party. Drew Thompson, NDP. Marlene Spruitt, Green Party. So I've been looking at the chat, so thank you for those participating in it. This is not obviously a big topic for most people. I think the most we've had on at one time was 7 viewers, but for this live stream, I do think that there'll be a few hundred more over the next week or so. Hi Jeff, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. Do you want to say anything on camera here? Okay. Is Jeff Green, the editor-in-chief of the Frontenac News. And I'll just keep it on live stream for a little bit. Okay, no one's asking questions or anything, so I'll just give my blessing, and then I'd like to try to meet some people around here. So anyone who's going to be watching this now or later, the Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless each and every one of you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Live in the truth, live free.